The most exciting thing about a launch of a new generation of graphics cards is almost always the increase in performance per dollar, because generally the new generation comes in at similar pricing to the previous generation, but offers a lot more performance at that same pricing tier. Now, there has been a lot of inflation recently, but nothing that explains a $1,200 price tag on an RTX 4080. Now, it does deliver performance better than the previous generation flagship, but it's also significantly cut down in performance compared to the RTX 4090, which is currently this generation's flagship. And if I did a price to performance calculation based on, the last generation flagship and its MSRP, we might get different results than if we compare it to something like, well, its predecessor, the RTX 3080, which is currently available still above its original MSRP, which is frankly kind of disgusting, but it is what it is. But we will be comparing it to that in this video. I'm going to release follow-up videos where I deep dive into the performance comparison against the 3090 Ti and the RTX 4090, so stay tuned to the channel if you're interested in further deep dives. In this video, we're looking at its predecessor, the RTX 3080, looking at the 4080, looking at what sort of performance uplift we get, as well as what sort of pricing we're looking at here, what sorts of new features, all of that, and looking at is it worth it? Also, when you're watching my side-by-side comparisons, look at the frame time graph. So a lot of people sometimes judge the smoothness of the performance in side-by-side comparisons based on how the video looks. But keep in mind that the frame rate of the video you're watching does not match the frame rate of the game actually being produced. So sometimes you'll see stuttery footage that was not stuttery on the actual variable refresh rate screen on which it was recorded. So look for spikes in the frame time graph if you want to see actual stutters that would be more noticeable on the actual screen when playing the game. Also note that I'm testing the RTX 3080 12GB version, not the original 10GB version, and it's the Gigabyte Eagle cooler at its out-of-the-box settings. And it's kind of a middle ground in between. It's a little bit faster than the 10GB version and a bit slower than the Ti model, so maybe it's kind of a middle ground for the 3080 lineup. And also I'm testing the 4080 Founders Edition at its out-of-the-box settings. Also, this is the test system here is my R9 5950X with 3600 CL16 memory. So most of the time, especially at high settings and at 4K, we're not CPU limited, but I will actually bring up a few cases where we do get a bit CPU limited, which is also an interesting test bed for DLSS 3 frame generation, which is certainly something we'll talk about today. Also, I did record the footage on each GPU's internal capture, which can sometimes have a 1 or 2% performance hit. Now, it's still an apples-to-apples comparison of both of them, but without recording, frame rates could be a tiny bit higher overall, so something to keep in mind. Let's jump into the benchmarks, and then we'll talk more with my final thoughts at the end. Let's start out by looking at Unreal Engine 5 performance, because a lot of new games will be targeting Unreal Engine 5 for their next-gen implementations. And this engine features an amazing lighting system, Lumen, as well as Nanite, which can allow us to get incredibly close. Like, you're going to see some fruit here in a second, and you can fly right up to these fruit models at an incredibly high detail, but you can just zoom into that kind of in real time using Nanite. Now, this is at 4K, and this is the Market of Light, which you can find on Steam, and it was built using an early access of this engine. Now, a downside here is there's no adjustable graphic settings, and this isn't really a game, so I can't tell you exactly how this stacks up against the performance levels we'll see in actual games. There's also no DLSS or anything like that for us to play with here, but we are seeing both GPUs delivering below a 60 FPS experience at 4K here, although the 4080 is about 38% faster in most scenes. Let's drop the resolution, and in this video we will be looking at ultra-wide 1440p, because I think that makes a lot more sense than looking at something like 1080p. And in this, we're seeing both GPUs doing a lot better, and while I understand that this resolution isn't super popular, overall, if you look at the Steam hardware survey, I think if you narrowed it down to people purchasing an enthusiast class GPU, then the percentage of people looking at ultra-wide 1440p monitors would actually be a more relevant percentage of the market. Here we're seeing the 4080 again about 38% faster and above 60 FPS, while the 3080 is below 60 FPS. And if we drop down to normal 1440p, 2560 by 1440, we're now seeing both GPUs doing a lot better. The RTX 3080 12GB is much more close, above 60 FPS, while as the 4080 is giving a higher refresh rate experience. Also, take a look at the power draw, by the way. Have you been noticing that the 4080 is delivering better performance at lower watts? Now, I will mention this is just what MSI Afterburner reports on wattage. I'm not measuring it from the wall or anything like that. And we're seeing about 37% faster here, so pretty consistent in this demo. But let's switch over to an actual next-gen game. Now, this isn't built on Unreal Engine 5. My understanding is that this is some sort of in-house engine made by this publisher. But this is one of the most beautiful games I've seen, and it's one published just on the next-gen consoles. There's no backwards compatibility with the older generation. And those consoles are only running this game at 1440p 30 FPS, although I think there might be a 40 FPS mode. The point is, newer games will be more demanding. Now, I'm running this at 4K native, but with DLAA, this game was updated, and it removed the resolution slider percentage scale, and it replaced it with an ultra quality setting, or quality, that kind of thing, but there was no way to just turn it off. So I know DLAA is native resolution, although it's more demanding than the TAA implementation. So anyway, we're seeing both GPUs fall below 60 FPS here, with the 4080 about 41% faster. So it's an interesting test here. And again, if you look at the wattages, the 4080 is drawing less power. Now, since they were below 60 FPS, I tried turning on DLSS Quality on both of them. And you can see now that the 3080 is about 60 FPS and the 4080 is well above 60 FPS. If we drop down to ultrawide 1440p in this same scene, we still see the 3080 below 60 FPS and the 4080 well above it and about 39% faster in this particular scene. And if we drop down into 1440p, again, look at native, well, with DLAA as well as DLSS Quality, we see the 3080 still below 60 FPS at 1440p, but with DLSS doing a better job. Now, even at 1080p, this game is pretty demanding, and we see 39% faster on the 4080 at equivalent settings, both of them doing a good job, but I think 1080p is going to be an unlikely use case here. Let's hop into an older game, but still one of the more demanding ones. And we're going to spend a lot of time here because this game has demanding just non-ray trace settings, but it also has very demanding ray tracing settings. It has a lot of options for us to play with, and also it does feature things like DLSS, so we can look at upscaling techniques. Here we're looking at the 4K Ultra settings, and we see that while the 4080 can be above 60 FPS at times, that doesn't mean it's always above 60 FPS, but the 3080 does not give you the ability to play this game at 4K Ultra with anything like a frame rate that I think most people would be targeting when you're spending this much money on a GPU and presumably 4K monitor, that kind of a thing. So overall, once again, we can take a look at the power draw and things like that. Now, cooling-wise, remember my 3080 isn't a Founders Edition, so it's not quite a fair comparison. But we do see the 4080 staying around 60 degrees, which is really nice to see, although this is a fairly short benchmark. Overall, the cooler seemed to stay cool and pretty quiet throughout the duration of my testing. Now here we're seeing about a 38% faster result and an average around 62 FPS here, although remember the 4080 did have minimums that were below 60 FPS. So in this test, I decided to actually look at what settings would you maybe play this game at if you actually wanted a higher refresh rate experience, you bought one of these GPUs, you wanted to play at 4K. So here we're looking at 4K high DLSS quality on the left and the right, but in the middle I thought it would be interesting to look at 4K high native performance on the 4080. I'm skipping a chunk of the benchmark here because we're going to spend a lot of time in the Cyberpunk benchmark, so I don't want to waste your guys' time showing the full benchmark run every time, although we will look at the results here, where we see about 39% faster at equivalent settings, and we do see the 4080 doing almost a 70 FPS average at 4K high in the minimums were closer to that 60 FPS mark. Now, if we look at ultra-wide 1440p here, we're gonna see both GPUs doing a lot better. The 3080 is having a much easier time staying above 60 FPS. And if you go down to the high settings with DLSS Quality, you can actually get a pretty high refresh rate experience on the 3080, which I thought was interesting to compare to the RTX 4080 at just the ultra settings. Again, we're going to skip ahead a bit in the benchmarks here, but both GPUs are doing a good job here, although again, for the high refresh rate experience, the 3080 had to turn down some settings and use some upscaling. We're seeing about 36% faster performance when we're comparing like-to-like performance at the ultra settings here. Now, if we drop down to normal 1440p, the 3080 can deliver a pretty high refresh rate, not extremely high refresh rate, but things will feel pretty smooth if you just play at 1440p ultra settings, native resolution. But if you go down to high settings with DLSS Quality, you are able to get well over 100 FPS experience. But the nice thing is, on the 4080 at the ultra settings, you're going to be getting that high refresh rate experience without needing DLSS. Now, I've looked at the DLSS image quality in this game in other videos, but if you look like the palm tree branches and things like that, the native resolution definitely does look better in a lot of scenes than the upscaled image. And again, we're seeing about 36% faster when looking at the like-to-like settings compared here with the ultra native 1440p results. Now, but what about ray tracing? Well, if you want to do ray tracing at 4K, it's going to be difficult for both GPUs. The RTX 3080 12GB, if you want to use RT Ultra, even DLSS performance will not get you 60 FPS in demanding scenes. Whereas the 4080 on DLSS performance is at least giving you a frame rate where you might be happy playing the game. Whereas the RTX 4080 could just go down to DLSS balanced if you wanted to get a roughly 60 FPS experience, and it still doesn't look as good as native. You look like the palm tree branches and things like that. But the main takeaway here is the 4080 actually using DLSS can use heavy ray tracing at 4K, although with the compromised image quality. Also here we're seeing 47% faster at like-to-like comparisons. So it's interesting to note here that the ray tracing results are delivering better performance increase over the previous generation than when we weren't ray tracing. And let's keep an eye out to see if that continues. But here we're looking at other ray tracing settings. What if you used 4K Ultra and then just turned on RT reflections with DLSS performance on the 3080? In other words, if you wanted to get decent frame rates and use ray tracing at 4K, what would you have to do on the 3080? On the 4080, I'm comparing it with those settings, but only going to DLSS Quality. And on the 4080, I'm looking at what if you wanted to max out ray tracing. So the RT Ultra setting doesn't include psycho lighting, which I've turned on here. And DLSS performance, again, to try to keep the frame rate high. I'm not giving you a percentage scaling here because these are not apples to apples comparisons. I'm looking more at if you want to target similar frame rate, what kinds of visual compromises would you have to make to use ray tracing? Now we're going to go ahead and look at ultra-wide again. So this is ultra-wide 1440p, 3440 by 1440. And we're looking at ray tracing ultra at its native resolution, and we're seeing both GPUs struggling here. But we're also looking at a non-like-for-like comparison on what sort of DLSS setting would you have to use to get decent playable results. On the 3080 12GB, going down to DLSS balanced at least keeps you around 60 FPS, whereas on the 4080, if we go to DLSS quality, you're not only well above 60 FPS, you're beating the performance at DLSS balanced on the 3080, so it's a better looking image. And when we compare the RT Ultra at native, we're seeing about a 44% faster result when we're comparing the native performance there, although again, at the native performance, neither one was delivering a very good experience. Now dropping down to normal 1440p, this is not ultra-wide, this is now normal 1440p, we're looking at what if you wanted to max out the ray tracing settings and use DLSS quality to get there. The frame rates weren't good enough to even consider at the native resolution when you're using RT Psycho. If you want to use ray tracing at the native resolution, you could try out just enabling RT reflections. You could also try other combinations, but they're one of the most visually noticeable things. The lighting's more subtle, but could even look better to some people. Anyway, we're seeing the 3080 kind of able to deliver around 60 FPS natively with RT reflections, whereas the 4080 with reflections is actually delivering a high refresh rate experience at the native resolution. When we compare the like-to-like comparisons here, it was about 47% faster in both comparisons when we're looking at the average frame rates. Now, I, again, don't think that 1080p is a very realistic, resolution choice to buy GPUs. It's expensive unless you're on an extremely high refresh rate monitor targeting esports performance. But so in other words, you might also play some single player games. I thought I'd highlight that the 3080 12GB actually can't run RT Psycho at 60 FPS, even at 1080p natively, whereas the RTX 4080 definitely can. So once again, we'll skip ahead in the benchmark here, not spend too much time dwelling on this. But it is absolutely consistent, at least in Cyberpunk, that we're seeing a bigger jump in ray tracing performance than we are in the native performance. And this is at 48% faster, I should say, rasterized performance. The ray tracing performance increase on generation is different. But let's look at some other games. This is Forza Horizon 5, and this game was recently updated to include ray tracing in the actual driving scenarios rather than just in the Forza Vista car viewer mode. It was also updated to include DLSS, but I actually don't like the image quality of DLSS in this game. That's a topic for another video, but the game was also updated a month or so ago, a couple months ago, with TAA rather than the game's MSAA. Anyway, we're looking at this at the extreme preset with TAA, so native resolution, and then with the RT settings turned up to extreme. And even at 4K, both GPUs are actually delivering an excellent experience. Obviously, the 4080 is faster with your more like your 100 FPS being a more typical result, whereas the 3080 is staying well above 60 FPS and it looks very smooth when actually playing the game. This is, of course, using the built-in benchmark to get the good side-by-side captures. Here we're seeing about 45% faster, but also notice that there's the GPU limited percentage. And the 3080 is mostly GPU limited, but the 4080 was reporting it only being GPU limited about half the time. So with a faster CPU, we might have seen even better results for the 4080. Now dropping down to 1440p ultra-wide, again, this is ultra-wide, not normal 1440p. Same graphic settings, native resolution again. This is TAA without any DLSS upscaling. Again, with the extreme preset and the RT settings turned up to extreme. We're seeing both GPUs do a nice job here. Now the power draw here is crazy because the 4080 is getting CPU limited. And so if you look at here, it's only about 33% faster, but the GPU limited percentage was only 9.1% on the 4080. So we're heavily CPU limited. But it is interesting to look at what happens to the power draw when you're getting CPU limit on the 4080, because then the GPU is not fully utilized. So this is 2560 by 1440. This is normal 1440p ultra-wide. Again, same setting, not ultra-wide. This is the normal 1440p. And this is extremely CPU limited on the right-hand side. You can see the GPU usage percent is nowhere near 100%. And the CPU usage isn't reporting 100% because it can't use all the threads. But we can see the GPU limited percentage was only 14.2% limited on the right. So again, it's 28% faster, but this is limited by my CPU. And so now if we drop down the settings even further to 1080p, we're now seeing the results even closer together because, once again, we are very, very CPU limited. But one thing that is kind of interesting to see here is that even though I am CPU limited, the 4080 is still producing better results, even when both GPUs have some CPU limitations going on here. So anyway, let's look at another game. So this is Marvel's Guardians of the Galaxy, and we have it at 4K native resolution at the maximum ray tracing settings. This game features ray traced reflections. You can also turn on ray traced reflections on transparencies, and there's various levels of ray traced reflection. I have it all maxed out here. And we can see that at native, the 3080 can't stay at 60 FPS. The 4080 is around 60 FPS a lot of the times, but does dip below. Turning on DLSS Quality improves the performance significantly on both, whereas now the 3080 is around the 60 FPS mark more of the time, and the 4080 is now a high refresh rate experience by using DLSS Quality. As a side note, I didn't really like DLSS Quality in this game myself. A lot of distant details looked a little bit more aliased, and personally I played it on my 3080 and turned settings down a bit to stay at native. Also notice that this section of the benchmark is really easy to run, so it inflates the overall averages when you see these average results at the end. Either way, we saw about a 47% and 45% uplift in performance when comparing the 4080 against the 3080. And again, that was with ray tracing enabled. But let's look at some non-ray tracing results. So the 3080 at 4K Ultra can definitely play this game extremely well. I don't know why we got a little stutter right there for a second, but the 4080 can deliver an even higher refresh rate experience. It's really incredible how fast these games run at 4K Ultra native. So I also tried on the 4080, what if you used ray tracing at the very high setting instead of ultra setting and turned off the transparencies? And we can see the 4080 33% faster at 4K Ultra, that's non-ray tracing, and you can also see some comparisons against itself, like how much performance do you lose when you enable ray tracing versus not ray tracing. So here we're looking at the same game, and this is at 1440p, and in this one I'm leaving the RT settings at the max because I think both GPUs do well enough with the ray tracing settings maxed out here that I would personally just use these settings. Also, both GPUs can get CPU limited here because if you don't have the ray tracing on, just because they can produce such high frame rates. And we're seeing about a 43% faster result on the 4080 versus the 3080 12GB here. And again, we'll look at 1080p real quick, more just for science, but the science is telling me that to see any meaningful difference here, I would need to have a faster CPU. Again, this is the R9 5950X. It has a lot of threads, so those extra threads don't really help out in gaming, so the CPU is the limiting factor here. You can see the 4080 not reporting anywhere near 100% utilization. So this is really more here just to illustrate that think about the rest of your system when planning an upgrade. If your CPU can't keep up, you're not going to actually get a meaningful performance uplift depending on resolution settings and the rest of your system. So now let's go ahead and look at an older ray tracing title. Now this is a game that only features ray traced shadows. You can adjust them to various settings. I went ahead and turned them all the way up to the ultra settings, so you could certainly turn them down. And I went to the highest preset, which is just the name of the preset, and then also enabled ray tracing ultra. We can see the 3080 below 60 FPS here, the 4080 above, and then DLSS Quality gets the 3080 to a much nicer frame rate to use. But the 4080 is a truly high refresh rate 4K experience once you've enabled DLSS Quality. And again, think about the image quality, performance hits and all that. And we're seeing about a 56% uplift here, which is actually bigger than what we saw in other games. Although I will also mention that at this point, I have now switched over to games that are being tested on a slightly different driver version. So important to note, I tried to get as much testing retested as I could for this video, but starting with this game and then moving forward, my 3080 is on the normal release drivers that came out along with the 4090, this is footage I recorded for my comparison against the 4090. Whereas the 4080 is using its preview, the drivers that you get as a reviewer. In all the previous games I tested before this game, I was using the same 4080 driver on both GPUs. I just honestly did not have enough time to update this. Now, non-ray traced versus ray traced, again, we saw a different performance uplift here. But since these results are a little bit different than what I was seeing in some other games, in terms of percentages, I did think it was worth noting the difference in drivers here, and I don't know if that's actually causing it. It could just be the game itself. But again, it's not like an old 3080 driver. As of the time of filming, it was the most up-to-date 3080 driver that is publicly available. But the 4080, again, gets its own review driver. So anyway, moving forward, there is that slight discrepancy in drivers, although they are both very up to date. Here we're seeing both of them delivering great performance, both with ray tracing on and off, 36% faster with RT off and 55% faster with RT on. Now, if we look at Spider-Man here, it's hard to get side-by-side comparisons actually swinging through the city because you actually have to manually do it. There's no built-in benchmark. This is 4K very high settings, so that's no ray tracing, but we can see that there is CPU limits happening here. Again, the 4080 is not being fully utilized. So definitely something to consider, and I won't bother with the percentage difference because of that. Also, when you enable ray tracing, it actually becomes even more CPU limited. And the 3080 is getting most of its performance out of it here if you look at the GPU utilization, but the 4080 is being held back pretty heavily by the CPU in this scenario. Now, DLSS frame generation is an interesting solution to CPU limited scenarios, but I'll explore that in a different part of the video. Here, we're looking at the at God of War. Now, this is a DX11 game, so I did want to fit in a DX11 game. We're also looking at the 4K Ultra Native performance and the performance with DLSS Quality enabled to see the types of settings that you could get when comparing these two. Kind of interesting that the 3080 with DLSS Quality in this game gives you a very high refresh rate experience. Other than right here's more typical of actual gameplay, where 4K Ultra without the DLSS boost is a little over 60 FPS most of the time on the 3080, and the DLSS kind of bumps it up above that. Over here, we're looking at, wow, I spaced the name, Horizon Zero Dawn, and we're seeing 4K Ultimate. But on the 3080, I also kicked on DLSS Quality just to see how close to catching up we could get to the 4080. Although honestly, even without DLSS, the 3080 is delivering very, very good performance in this game. So really, I'm including some of these less demanding games and games that don't feature ray tracing, things like that, in order to illustrate that the types of games you play will impact which GPU actually makes the most sense. We're seeing about a 31% faster result here, although frame rates are high enough that we could be seeing some CPU limitation. If we drop down to the ultra-wide 1440p results, we're again seeing the 4080 a lot faster than the 3080, but both of them are so fast that I'm not convinced it's a meaningful difference. So once again, this is to illustrate that depending on the type of game that you play, this, the upgrade might not be worth it. Here's 30% faster. Again, some CPU limitations throughout the benchmark. And as we go down to normal 1440p, this is no longer ultra-wide 1440p, this is normal 1440p, we are now seeing even more CPU limitations happening. Again, the 4080 especially not always near 100% utilization, so we're only seeing about 26% faster here, but both of them are so fast it doesn't matter, and it's kind of CPU limited anyway. Let's take a look at Red Dead Redemption 2. This is 4K, and I've adjusted the graphics preset slider all the way to the right. And then we've also tried out the 3080 with DLSS Quality to see how much that can close the gap between it and the 4080. Also, I'm testing this game in Vulkan just to make sure we get a Vulkan test in this game. I know some people would play it on DX12, and that's fine. But I did want to make sure we test out the performance differences in various APIs, make sure we get some DX12, DX11 with God of War, and then here's some Vulkan testing. Anyway, the DLSS in this game can sharpen up some of the TAA, but I think the TAA actually got upgraded a little bit. But I don't like how the hair, if you look at his hair, it looks a little bit checkered when using DLSS. But anyway, we're seeing about 37% faster when comparing the like-to-like native performance here, which is, again, pretty typical of what we're seeing for our non-ray tracing results. Now, in this, we're seeing the ultra-wide 1440p. Native resolution here, I did not bother with DLSS because performance is honestly really, really good on both of them. Obviously, the 4080 is faster, but I don't think anybody would be unhappy with playing this game on the 3080 12GB. And if we look at the results here, we're about 38% faster, which again seems pretty typical when we're not looking at ray tracing performance. So the Vulkan game didn't really seem to do much to change that. Here we're looking at normal 1440p, so 2560 by 1440. And once again, both of them are performing very well. I don't think anybody would complain about either of these, and it's completely maxed out, and we're seeing about a 36% faster result overall. I think the benchmarks have established that the RTX 4080 is a good GPU. It performs really well. It's more energy efficient than its predecessor. It performs better, but the real problem with it is its performance per dollar. So here's the thing. If I hop into PC Part Picker right now, this is live, this is a website, not a screenshot, I'm interacting with it, and I search RTX 3080 and I sort price low to high, I could get a 10GB model for a little less than $750, and I could get a 12GB model, similar but not identical to the one I tested in this video, for $790. Now, it's honestly still frustrating that these prices are above the original MSRP, but it is what it is. Anyway, now if we jump into like a scientific calculator, for example, and we take the $790, since I tested a 12GB version in this, and if we're generous on the rasterized performance uplift of calling it 40%, even though in most games I tested it was actually below 40%, and we just multiply the price by the performance uplift, we actually come in at less than the MSRP of the 4080, which is concerning. And then if we look at the ray tracing performance uplift, which was not usually 50%, it was usually less than that. But again, let's be generous and call it a 50% uplift. And again, multiplying the price to performance comes in at close to, but still below the $1,200 asking price. So what is going on here? Well, I think Nvidia has two problems right now. The first problem is that they still need to sell their 3000 series GPUs. And like I said, 3080s are still commanding a pretty high price, and Nvidia wants to keep it that way. So by launching GPUs that have better performance than the 3000 series, but scaling it roughly equally with the price to performance, what they're effectively doing is extending the 3000 series generation by adding in new GPUs on top instead of replacing them. And again, usually, as I said in the beginning of this video, the exciting thing about a new generation of GPUs is that the new generation comes in at similar pricing to the previous generation, but offers much better performance and technologies. And that just isn't happening here. And that's what's so disappointing about this. I understand there has been a lot of inflation. So as much as I would hate to see like a $900 price tag on a 4080, that would be a lot easier to swallow than a $1,200 price tag. And again, if we saw a $900 price tag, we might actually be seeing a small, but at least there, improvement in performance per dollar. But we're just not getting that here. Also, to make matters worse, we're seeing early reports. This is a videocards.com article that has screenshots of Micro Center's pricing for AIB partner cards of the RTX 4080. So when you actually go out to buy these, many of them will cost significantly more than $1,200. We are seeing companies offering a $1,200 model, but I would expect those to sell out quickly, and then the majority of stock to be emphasizing the more expensive versions. Now, some of these are just a little bit more expensive, which is understandable and typical of AIB partner cards and their coolers and factory overclocks. However, some of these are absolutely ridiculous. We're seeing the ROG Strix OC listed at almost $1,600. That is basically the price, well, the MSRP of the RTX 4090, which is absolutely insane. We're seeing the TUF OC model listed at $1,500, Zotac Amp Aero at $1,400, the MSI Supreme X at $1,400, Gigabyte Aorus Master at $1,350. So again, these are significant price increases over the already bad price of $1,200. Now, why are they doing this? How are they doing this? Well, if you tried to buy a 4090 right now, they cost over $2,000 because supply and demand have not really met up here. So Nvidia is probably encouraged that the 4090s are selling at their large price tags, and so they know they can get this one slotted in there as well. But then also this leaves a massive price delta between the 4080 and the 4090. So the AIB partners have room to tack on hundreds of dollars and still undercut the price of the 4090. However, the 4080 versus the 4090 itself is also a disappointing comparison because in previous generations, we saw, like the 3000 series, we saw the 3080 offering close to the performance of a 3090. It was not a massive performance delta, but for a huge pricing delta. And they have not continued that practice for the 4000 series. The 4080 performs significantly slower than the 4090. And is still priced kind of in line with it. In other words, I kind of excused the 4090 for its price to performance because generally the top-end flagship GPU has a performance per dollar penalty, like we saw with the 3090 versus the 3080. I didn't care that the 3090 was extremely expensive compared to a 3080 because people buying it just understood there was diminishing returns, and the 3080's MSRP was actually good performance per dollar uplift. In this generation, we're just not seeing that. There is a significant gap between the two in performance, and the price of the 4080 is still way too high. Now, I think Nvidia is going to try to justify this, like their marketing claimed 2 times the performance of the previous generation. Where is that coming from? Well, it's coming from their DLSS 3 frame generation technology. But calling that increased performance is wrong. It's increased motion fluidity. It is not increased performance. What frame generation does is it holds back a future frame and another frame and inserts an AI-generated frame in between. This frame does not interact with the game engine, so it does not increase your ability to interact with the game engine. In other words, latency does not get better. The game's performance does not get better. The motion fluidity gets better, at a cost to image quality and latency. Now, this has its use cases and it is a good feature, but if you are primarily looking for high refresh rate competitive gaming, this feature is completely useless, and if it's available in competitive games, you should turn it off. It makes latency worse, not better, and the whole reason you want high frame rates in competitive games is to decrease input latency. However, in slower-paced single-player games, I do think frame generation has its place. I've played with it extensively on my RTX 4090 and also followed up on my 4080 in 2 games, Plague Tale Requiem and Spider-Man Remastered. In Plague Tale Requiem, I actually think the image quality looks excellent, and it's such a slow-paced game that the increased input latency was honestly irrelevant to my enjoyment of the game. And in the end, I actually left frame generation on when I finished up the last half of Plague Tale Requiem. I really enjoyed it and helped smooth out the experience on my 120Hz 4K monitor. However, there was one issue I ran into, which is frame generation currently does not support VSync or frame rate limiting, and so those options are grayed out in games. You cannot select them when you enable frame generation. You can force it through NVIDIA's control panel, and I did that when I used it because the screen tearing when I went over 120 Hz was noticeable, and I did not like that. So I forced it, and I believe that can have some compatibility issues, or else why are they graying it out in the game? I think you might get increased latency or some frame pacing issues. However, in Plague Tale Requiem, on a controller, I'm not using a mouse, that kind of thing, the latency felt fine, and the image quality actually looked really good. However, I had a completely different experience in Spider-Man Remastered. When just swinging around or running up buildings, there's this weird ghosting, fizzling aura around Spider-Man himself, and it's incredibly distracting, and I don't like it. So in Spider-Man Remastered, I will not use frame generation, and if I need more frames, I'll find some other way. Now, it is nice that it helps in CPU-limited situations, which actually was helpful in Plague Tale Requiem, because normal DLSS does not help you out in a CPU-limited situation because it's decreasing the GPU demand, not the CPU demand, whereas frame generation increases the motion fluidity of the game regardless of what the CPU is doing. So that's kind of useful and interesting. In other games, like F122, I haven't tested that myself, but watching other people's testing, it has issues with UI elements and looks quite bad. So my final thoughts on frame generation is it has its place, it's useful in very selective situations in single-player games, but is certainly in its current format not going to be something significantly boosting your performance in most games and most situations. In a lot of situations, you should just turn it off, although I do recommend trying it out in games where it's available in order to see what you think. Because I think, like I said, in Plague Tale Requiem, I actually quite liked it. So this isn't all it's cracked up to be in NVIDIA marketing, but it's also not completely useless, like you see in the comment sections from people who honestly probably haven't actually tried it themselves yet, although it is completely useless in many, many situations. Now, the last thing I'll leave you guys with is, so will we ever see better pricing? Should you buy this thing? I mean, I think in general, like, okay, if you're looking for an Nvidia GPU and you're just not willing to consider AMD and you want to buy a GPU right now, this is a good graphics card, and if you just are okay with not getting a good deal, you could certainly buy this. Look at the performance numbers, it performs well. If you're willing to consider AMD, AMD is marketing their upcoming 7900 XT and XTX cards as competitors to the RTX 4080 at a lower price. These will be coming out on December 13th. Now, we don't have these out to actually review yet, so we can't tell you exactly what's going to happen. But according to performance slides like these from AMD, it's likely that the AMD GPUs will outperform a 4080 in rasterized performance, although that's not guaranteed yet. We do not have these in hand for side-by-side comparisons. Stay tuned to the channel, I do plan on doing so. Also, in ray tracing performance, while AMD is claiming a healthy uplift in ray tracing performance, given the percentages that they're saying, and these are marketing slides, it is unlikely, and I would say just downright just not going to happen, that the 7900 series from AMD will be a meaningful competitor to the 4080 in ray tracing performance, although I would love to be proved wrong about that. Now, AMD also highlights a few other, advantages that they have, like having a DisplayPort 2.1 connection versus 1.4a on the RTX 4080. I wish NVIDIA's 4000 series had the updated DisplayPort connection, but at the resolutions and frame rates most people are actually using and monitors are actually using, I don't think this is a huge deal, although I do think it would have been nice to see that on a GPU this expensive. Also, AMD is targeting the size of the 4080 and 4090 and the power plugs and all that. So hopefully the 4080 power plugs don't have the fire issues that some 4090 power plugs are having. It does run at significantly lower power, so I'm hoping that doesn't end up being an issue, and I didn't see any issues during testing, but that's a sample size of 1, obviously. So overall, what to make of the RTX 4080? Well, I mean, it's bad price to performance. However, I think it's a really good GPU. And so honestly, it's probably going to sell out anyway, as we've seen with the 4090. So if you want to buy it, go ahead and buy it. It's probably going to sell out on day one. And if you already know you're not going to buy the AMD competitor, maybe use productivity applications, because NVIDIA does have a lot of support in productivity apps that AMD simply doesn't. So a lot of people who use these for work as well as gaming really just are locked into NVIDIA as their option. Also, if you're interested in ray tracing, that's something. And AMD's competitor to DLSS 3 frame generation isn't coming out until sometime next year. So there are advantages here. So if you want to buy one, you could. Just don't be thinking you're getting good value. Stay tuned to the channel if you're interested in detailed head-to-head comparisons against the GPUs like the 3090 Ti and the 4090 with the 4080. All of that is incoming. I like to focus on head-to-head comparisons one at a time. These should be coming out soon. I hope all of you have an excellent day.